This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello, I'm Carolyn Quinn. Thank you for downloading this edition of the Westminster Hour on BBC Radio 4 for Sunday, the 11th of November. Is a no-deal Brexit looking likelier than ever, with momentum towards a cabinet agreement stalling and a seventh ministerial resignation? Answers, there are none, but of opinions, there are plenty. So we seek them with my panellists. The Conservative Brexit supporter John Whittingdale, Labour's Shadow Treasury Minister Annalise Dodds, and from Chatham House, the international relations expert Dr Leslie Vinjamuri. Sam Coates from The Times is our guide to what people are really saying around the corridors at Westminster. And as the nation commemorates the centenary of the Armistice, we discuss how Parliament remembers those who died. And I'd like to just get your thoughts, first of all, on that. Later in the programme, we're going to be exploring the impact of the First World War on Parliament. But for now, a quick reflection from you all about what this day means to you. And John, this evening you've been at a rather special commemoration service, haven't you?
I have. I mean, like every MP, I started the day by laying a wreath in my own constituency in Malden, where we had an amazing turnout. And we always have a good turnout, but I think this day particularly, even more people have come out. But this evening I was very privileged to be invited to attend the National Armistice service in Westminster Abbey, which the Queen was present at with the President of Germany, who made a reading in German, and the whole of her royal family, the government, opposition, and a lot of young people there. And the Abbey was packed, and I don't know if our listeners have saw any of it, but it was a very moving occasion.
And Annalise, the nation really does seem to have come together on this particular day, doesn't it?
Absolutely, and I think it's been very touching to see how that's happened across generations, actually. I also took part in my local ceremony this morning in Oxford, and I suppose the very poignant aspect of ceremonies over recent years has been the fact that, of course, we don't have any veterans from the First World War. From the Second World War, we have those people who often are at the very end of the procession and really struggling, but absolutely determined to be there, to be able to remember their fallen friends and family. And I think it's very moving to see them joined with all the young people who take part, particularly this year. We had an enormous turnout in Oxford from everybody from the Scouts to the Sea Cadets, and huge numbers of ordinary people who just came along, and also supported by people from our twin towns, including Bonn in Germany. So, yeah, it was very moving, I think, this year, and very, very important, because as those people sadly fade away, we need to remember more than ever what their sacrifice was, and quite how fragile peace is as well. I think it's very important we remember that.
And from you, Leslie, as an American who's lived here for several years, how do you view a day like this?
Well, first of all, it's remarkably beautiful just to watch the morning ceremonies in Whitehall, the laying of the wreaths, just tremendous. But I was also watching it alongside watching Macron and Merkel and President Trump in France, and the internationalism that was on display by Macron, trying to really take this moment and use it as a moment to reclaim the importance of cooperation, of transatlantic cooperation in particular, and launch his new Paris Peace Forum, which is to re-embrace multilateralism. So the contrast was extraordinary, but it was really a beautiful day.
And we'll be delving a little bit more into international relations later in the programme. But for now, no sign yet this weekend that any other minister is planning imminently to follow Jo Johnson out of the government door, though rumour has it that 4 may be considering it. I talk, of course, about Brexit. The Transport Minister's shock resignation is continuing to cause ructions in Tory ranks. And as one MP told me this evening, the question of Theresa May's leadership is firmly back on the table once again. Hopes of getting the Cabinet to sign off on Brexit deal proposals this week appear to be rapidly receding. Brexiteers and the DUP are warning that they'll vote against any agreement which, in their view, threatens the union and could put a trade border down the Irish Sea. And we are fast approaching the day when the no-deal preparations have to get underway in earnest. Sam Coates, give us a sense of what may happen this week, because there was a momentum feeling last week, a sense that maybe the Cabinet was going to agree a deal. That's gone now, hasn't it?
Well, not entirely. I think when talking about Brexit, it's helpful to divide it essentially into two halves. You've got what's going on, as it were, in Brussels, and then what's going on domestically. So let's start with the Brussels end. Ollie Robbins, the Prime Minister's chief negotiator, is out in Brussels at the moment. There are further meetings tomorrow. As I understand it, there is a touch more optimism than you might expect, according to my Brussels colleagues. Essentially, the negotiations are stuck on two issues. The first is fishing and what happens if we enter the backstop, which is the Northern Ireland insurance proposal in order to ensure Northern Ireland doesn't have a hard border that has ramifications to the whole of the United Kingdom. Can the European Union automatically fish in our waters? So that's issue one that's still to be resolved. Issue two is if we end up using this backstop in order to prevent a hard border in Northern Ireland, can Britain get out of it? And can it get out of it itself, or does it have to rely on the European Union to do that? Now, there are reports each way about quite how that's going, and no doubt more details will emerge. It sounds as if elements of what we wanted, the UK wanted, haven't been accepted by the European Union. But if I'm being blunt on behalf of the British media, we're not totally sure what is being asked for in a great deal of specificity, and we're not totally sure what some cabinet ministers' red lines are. So that, to me, is in a sort of holding state. Then, if you turn to the domestic agenda, I still think the biggest thing that has happened in the last few days is the resignation of Jo Johnson, and I didn't really think that the Sunday papers moved us a lot along from that. Why was Jo Johnson's resignation so important? Well, I think it's for this reason. For months, we have been writing enthusiastically about the objections of Brexiteers, people like John sitting next to me, and the reasons why they will probably vote down Theresa May's deal because it leaves you too close to the European Union. But what Jo Johnson did is he attacked what Theresa May's doing from a Remainer point of view. Now, his ultimate solution is to stay in the European Union, but his critique, some elements of which are shared by Brexiteers, essentially suggests that what we would be doing by signing up to Theresa May's Brexit deal is taking away all of the leverage, all of the incentives for the European Union to give us a good eventual deal once we get through Brexit Day and continue with those negotiations. And I think, talking to MPs, Remain MPs, I think Jo Johnson's 1,600-word article published on Friday just made a few more butterflies in their stomach, made them just question whether or not, as most of them had been going to do, they were all definitely going to do it. So where are the numbers? 51 Tory Brexiteers have publicly signed up to the Stand Up for Brexit website. They suggest they'll vote them down. I suspect some of them will peel off while publicly maintaining that they're going to do it.
And that's the group that John
is in.
Sitting here
and then
belongs to.
And then I think there are about 8 Tory MPs from the Remain side who are looking like they're going to vote against it from a Remain perspective. Most of those really because they want a second referendum, and it looks as if the DUP aren't on board. So those are horrific numbers for Theresa May, and it looks, based on public statements, she wouldn't get it through. But there's a long way left to go. All
right, we had different views articulated today by Cabinet Ministers. Andrea Leadsom, the leader of the Commons, insisting that the UK mustn't be held against its will in a customs arrangement with the EU as part of that backstop insurance policy to avoid a hard border in Northern Ireland. But then you had the message coming through from Damien Hines. We're going to hear him in a sec. He's the Education Secretary. And with apologies to the Rolling Stones, you can't always get what you want.
We have to see what comes back, and of course everybody in Parliament will be looking at that very closely, and they need to think about, what's right for the future of our country. They need to think about what the alternatives are as well. It's no good just not liking individual aspects. You've got to have in mind, if you're going to take that view, you've got to have in mind a realistic, viable, deliverable alternative. I think people are going to be getting behind this deal and saying, yeah, let's get on with it. It's right for our economy. Let's move forward.
So, John Whittingdale, I imagine that message is directed towards you, the message that we're in the territory now of effectively choosing the least worst option, perhaps, having to compromise a bit, suck up things you may not like. Are you prepared to compromise to get a deal?
Well, it's not a question of compromising. Part of the problem is that what the Prime Minister set out to ask for was unacceptable to a lot of us because it kept us bound into the European Union, still subject to the rulings of the European Court of Justice, still paying in money. And so it wasn't for us a proper Brexit. But when you say Damien Hinds is appealing to people like me, I mean, I think Sam is right. What Joe Johnson has proved is that actually nobody really likes Chequers. Those of us who supported Brexit don't think Chequers delivers it.
And Chequers deal, that was the deal suggested, the Chequers proposal suggesting a common rule book with the EU. And
which was an Ollie Robbins invention, and that it was that led to both David Davis and Boris Johnson leaving the government. But what Joe Johnson has proved is that it is equally unacceptable to those who strongly believe in continued membership of the European Union, because it is the worst of both worlds.
Well, he described it as vassalage, but then the alternative, a no-deal Brexit, he described as chaos.
Well, I don't want a no-deal Brexit
on a scale unseen since the Suez Crisis.
I think a no-deal Brexit is not a desirable outcome. I think we can make it work, but I would much rather have a deal. And what is frustrating is that when I went to see Michel Barnier with the Select Committee a few weeks ago, he presented us the EU proposal, which is a Canada plus type of agreement, which actually gave us most of the things that we wanted. And therefore, if we could only have started talking about that, I think there was a much stronger chance we could have got an arrangement and avoided no deal.
But the Irish border issue comes up when you talk about
the Irish border does, but I mean, the Irish border is not insoluble. The EU have already accepted that it is possible to do pre-border checks, that there are arrangements which already are in place in some other parts of the EU. We haven't even tried to find a solution because we've been so fixated about trying to push through Chequers.
All right. Well, Annalise, you've heard that people say there is a solution to the Northern Ireland border issue. Plenty of other people say there isn't unless there's an element of customs union and single market involvement. So how do you see this week panning out? It seems that the Cabinet are going to meet on Tuesday, but perhaps not to discuss a deal. I don't think it's even on the agenda, is it, Sam, as far as you know?
Nothing's on the agenda yet.
OK.
Yeah, well, I think yet again we're seeing our policy towards the rest of the EU being dominated by the internal machinations of the Conservative Party and not being dominated by what's in the national interest. And actually the vast majority of people in the world of business and other expert commentators recognise that you need to have some kind of a customs union if you're going to avoid the kind of bureaucracy and problems that will be an issue not just for the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, but also for particularly manufacturers with complex supply chains wherever they are in the UK. And that's why we've said for a long time we need to actually be seeking a customs union, not in the short term, but as a long-term solution that would help to protect jobs. And that really is what our government should be focused on, not which backbenchers it can pick off, but what's in the best interest of our country.
Well, the fact is, though, that we're working with the sort of deal that Theresa May is trying to strike. And as a former MEP, do you see the EU being prepared to blink first as a way of unlocking this logjam that we seem to have reached?
Well, I think the logjam has pretty much been created within the Conservative Party. I don't think it's particularly been created from the EU side. They've been, I must say, relatively consistent in their position. I think we set off on the wrong path when Theresa May, at the very beginning of this process, set out those red lines that included things like not having any permanent role for the European Court of Justice. Now, that was not sensible because actually you could perfectly easily have mechanisms which would respect Britain's sovereignty as well as the EU 27s, but that was never looked at, and instead we've been locked against options that would have protected jobs in particular. And we've ended up in what is an illogical situation, which, as I said, is not really focused on what should be determining policy now, the interests of our country and not internal party politics.
Sam?
Here's why it's really hard to see what happens next. Theresa May can't get her deal through because she doesn't have the numbers. I'm not sure that you can do the Canada deal that John suggests, because even if you can sort out Northern Ireland, you can't do so before next March. The People's Vote requires the Prime Minister to change their position. Norway, for now, would be rejected by the EU, and no deal would cause mass resignations from the Tory government. That's why I don't know what's going to happen in the next few months.
All right. Well, I mean, none of us know. And that's why we're just expressing views and seeking opinions. And we'll bring you in, Leslie, in just a moment. But at some point, the action will move from the Cabinet to Parliament. You'll remember there was quite a battle for MPs to be given a meaningful vote on the outcome of the negotiations. Of course, we don't know if there will be an outcome or a deal to vote on. The Commons Procedure Committee is looking into this. In the meantime, we've been consulting an expert on constitutional law and Brexit at the House of Commons Library. He's Senior Clerk Graham Cowie. Now, I asked him first to outline the process if Theresa May does manage to secure a deal with the EU and brings it to Parliament.
The expectation is that the government will first lay 3 documents before Parliament. The first is a statement that agreement has been reached with the European Union. The second is a copy of the withdrawal agreement, so the text of the treaty that is going ultimately to be ratified. And the third is a copy of the framework for the future relationship. At that point, there will be, we assume, some opportunity for parliamentarians to consider the content of those 2 texts. We don't know yet whether there will be any committee reporting on that, whether there will be enough time for that. But after that has happened, we'll expect a motion to be moved by a Minister of the Crown before the House of Commons that will purport to approve both of those texts.
Will MPs be able to say, oh, we don't like that, or it's not bad, but how about adding this, that or the other?
As a substantive motion, the default position would be that it would be capable of being amended. The question that the government has raised is whether, if amendments were made, that would create legal ambiguity as to whether Parliament had been taken to have approved the deal. So that's why they have said that they want to be able to have a vote on a clean motion, an unamended motion. The idea is that that vote would be a straight choice between approving and not approving the agreements presented before them.
So if there are MPs who would like to introduce the idea of having a further referendum, or who want to say, well, let's delay the Article 50 process a bit longer, could they make that suggestion at this stage of the process?
Certainly they have been mooted as potential ways in which some people may attempt to amend those motions. The government's concern in those circumstances is that that would be taken to amount to a rejection of the agreements. Bluntly, there is legal ambiguity as to whether that would be the case.
But if amendments aren't put down, does that mean that effectively MPs will be asked to vote on Theresa May's proposal, or that means no deal with the EU?
That is the default scenario. That does not necessarily mean that Parliament can't find other ways of expressing a view as to what should happen in the absence of a deal. How the government ultimately responds to that is a matter for them, and the consequences of that in turn is ultimately a matter for Parliament.
Because for many MPs, expressing a view won't be enough. I mean, the bottom line is that this is Parliament's big opportunity to wrest control of the Brexit process back from the government if they're unhappy with the way that the government's been handling it. So if they don't like whatever Theresa May comes back with, what then?
This is the $15 million question, isn't it? The problem or the dilemma that faces MPs is that there is not any legal mechanism by which they can insist upon an alternative other than no deal to what the government brings forward. That doesn't necessarily mean that alternatives cannot be put, but it means that the means by which they might seek to achieve that are necessarily political rather than legal. Obviously, after this motion, we still need to have a bill to implement a withdrawal agreement. Realistically, that's going to have to be passed from beginning to end within 4, if not 3 months. That would be a heavily accelerated timetable, and it is not necessarily going to be straightforward to get that bill through, even if this motion passes.
What role does the House of Lords play in all of this?
So the House of Lords doesn't have a formal role at the beginning of the process. It doesn't have a direct equivalent of what MPs are calling a meaningful vote. It has to be given the opportunity to consider, to take note of, as the Act says, the agreements that have been brought forward. But it doesn't necessarily have to vote on that before they proceed to the next stage.
What happens if there is no resolution, for example, to the Irish border issue, the talks break down, it just proves impossible to reach agreement. What's Parliament's role then?
So the Withdrawal Act provides for 3 no-deal scenarios in which ministers must then outline their next steps. The first is if Parliament is taken to have rejected a deal. The second is if the Prime Minister concludes at any point before the 21st of January that no political agreement can be reached. And the third is if that date is reached and no agreement has actually been reached. There are then set statutory deadlines within which a statement has to be made as to how the government intends to proceed. And then there must be motions moved in both the Commons and the Lords to the effect that they have considered this matter. The substance of that debate, of course, will be influential as to what the government intends to do next. But there are no direct legal effects of that motion. It doesn't have to pass. If it passes, it has no direct legal consequences. But it will be an indication of Parliament's view as to whether the government's proposed next steps are acceptable.
That's Graham Cowie, the senior clerk at the House of Commons Library, setting out what could happen. I mean, basically, he's saying the timetable is if there's a deal, MPs will get a vote on what the government want to be a clean motion, either accept the deal or no deal. That should come before Christmas, perhaps. And then if nothing is agreed, the other option then moves to looking at the date of January 21st, when Parliament again would get a say on what should happen next if there is no deal. I mean, it's hugely complicated and we're trying to pick our way through this. But John, can I just ask you now, Remainers and Brexiters, as we've discussed, committed to voting against the deal that Theresa May brings back. What about you? I mean, are you saying now categorically you will vote against a deal if she manages to secure one?
Well, obviously, I want to see what the deal will contain. But if it is going to consist of continued membership of customs union or a extension of the transitional period without a defined endpoint, that is not something I could support. So we wait to see what comes back. I mean, my committee, the Select Committee, took evidence from David Natzler, who is your Clark's boss, if you like, and we spent a long time on this meaningful vote question. And the truth appears to be that actually the meaningful vote doesn't require the government to do anything. If there is a deal, then it is going to be the bill which is critical, because there has to be legislation to enact the deal, and obviously legislation can be changed by Parliament.
And that is the implementation bill. It's got a different title.
It's called the Withdrawal Agreement and Implementation Bill, known as the WABE to those who are sort of
but that
geeks
has
on
to
this
get
issue.
through. That has to get through all its common stages in order for Brexit to happen.
And we would, I suspect, be sitting all night for several days in a row.
Well, and also the House of Lords get a say over that, and they can slow the whole process down.
It will be very complicated, but that's if a deal exists. If there is no deal, under any of the scenarios which were outlined, then the government, the House of Commons has an opportunity to vote on it, but it is not binding on the government. And no deal means we exit on the 29th of March, because that is already in legislation.
Well, Annalise, the question for Labour has been, and I know that you will say you want a general election if you get to this sort of constitutional crisis and logjam within Parliament. But in the absence of a general election, and if you are presented as a party with take Theresa May's deal, whatever it is, or leave with no deal, would you not be minded to support that if it gave some elements of what you've asked in your 6 tests?
Well, I still hope that Theresa May might eventually end up listening to the voices of business and others and realise that the direction she's going is the wrong one. And, for example, recognise that we need to be in a customs union for the future. And so I hope that she'll change her position. But if she doesn't, and if that deal that she's proposing doesn't meet Labour's 6 tests, which, I stood on at the last general election, I think it's very important to be accountable. And I said to my constituents I would use those 6 tests to judge any deal. If it doesn't match up to them, then I am not going to vote for that deal. And Labour is not going to vote for that deal.
But Labour has said, hasn't it, that you want free movement to end as part of honouring the referendum deal. So if free movement ends, then that's already one of the 6 tests that you set is the exact same benefits once we leave.
But that's what we were promised by Theresa May's cabinet and by Theresa May herself.
A throwaway remark by David Davis.
I don't think it was quite so throwaway, actually. They said they could achieve that. I think it's very important that they're held to it. And actually, the reason why we're in this situation where we have this real Hobson's choice, really, between what looks like will be 2 unacceptable options, a very flawed deal if it continues in the form that it looks like it's going to, or no deal, is because government itself has decided that's how it wants to present it to Parliament. You could have a situation where government would say, right, we'll give Parliament the choice to have another option, to go back, speak to Parliament, find out what Parliament wants and what we could negotiate again with the EU. But they've decided not to do that. They've decided just to give us this choice, kind of Russian roulette, really, between these options, both of which look like they'd be very negative for the UK. And that is not a democratic way to be proceeding in these circumstances.
Well, Leslie, Graham Cowie was mentioning that there would be not necessarily legal means of offering alternatives, but that MPs like Annalise and John may find political ways of breaking through. So that could mean pushing for a further referendum, for instance. I mean, can you see that as a possibility, or extending Article 50?
Well, it does seem to me that it is a political question properly and not a legal question. It was a political question to begin with. It was a vote by the people. And to turn it into a legal question seems to turn it into something that doesn't really put the primary question up front. And it seems that we are talking about deadlines, which are certainly real in legal terms, but they're very artificial when it comes to the most significant question. So right now, I agree with what Annalise has said, that this threat of an exit without a deal doesn't seem like a very wise idea. And extending the Article 50 deadline seems like a very wise and very pragmatic choice, given that there is no clear deal on the table right now.
Well, Sam, obviously there'd be objections to that from across the House, but also support for an option like that. Can I just touch on somebody said to me today that the question of Theresa May's leadership, because of what's happened over the last few days, the Jo Johnson resignation as well, has now brought to the fore again questions about her and whether there should be a leadership challenge prompted. What are you hearing about that? Has Graham Brady got his letters, the chairman of the 1922?
Well, I certainly don't believe some of the rumours in the papers today that Graham Brady is refusing to accept letters from some Tory MPs. I think there would be a great hue and cry if that were if that were the case.
What, barricading himself in his room and saying no more?
I don't know, but it strikes me as unlikely. Look, I think the reason that there are questions about leadership is because nobody can see the way through. And Theresa May, over the process of the last 2.5 years, has made so many categorical statements. There will be no extension to Article 50. There will be no second referendum. We are leaving the customs union. We are leaving the single market, and on and on and on. So at some point, she's going to start letting people down, but she's tried to hold on for so long, trying to give the appearance of keeping so many people on board. Today, this weekend, yes, there was a little bit of chatter about it, but it wasn't front and centre of people's mind. I think at the moment, the biggest risk to her deal is the Cabinet when they see the deal. I think that's of the EU, Parliament and the Cabinet. I think it's that third one that is the most critical just at the moment as they come and assess it. And then other things will flow from there.
And of course, the assessment is not just on the withdrawal agreement that's drawn up over Northern Ireland and the divorce deal and the rights of citizens, but also the wider political declaration setting out the way ahead. John, before we move on, I've just got to ask you this, though. I mean, are your constituents all happy with the idea of a no-deal Brexit? You know, there have been expressions of fears of medicine shortages, the Channel ports gridlocked. I mean, Jo Johnson himself talked about the prospect of Kent becoming the lorry park of England is very real in a no-deal scenario. Don't you have some concerns that a no deal could lead to that sort of disruption and chaos?
As I said earlier, I don't want a no deal outcome because I think it will lead to short-term disruption. The reason it will is because we did not start making the preparations nearly soon enough. Had we put in place some of the measures which could have been dealt with earlier to deal with a possible no deal, it could have been dealt with, it would have been much smoother. Those are only now being exercised, and I suspect that does mean that if we leave without a deal, it will cause short-term disruption. Now, I'm not saying that we can't get over that, and I think in the longer term we'll be much better off. But there is no question that there will be some problems. But going back to your question about what my constituents feel, I mean, I represent an area which voted to leave, and as I said to the Prime Minister in the statement a couple of weeks ago, I think what they feel most of all is that it's now 2 years since they voted, and they're now being presented with possibly a further 2 years or even longer before we finally leave. And they're saying, why is it taking so long? We told you what we wanted 2 years ago.
Let's move on to other things happening this week. The Prime Minister's making a foreign policy speech at the Lord Mayor's banquet tomorrow. Just briefly, Sam, what are we expecting?
Theresa May is going to talk about her belief in the rules-based international order. Now, in talking about that, she's clearly making reference to Russia, what happened in Salisbury, the international alliance that she managed to build up after the Salisbury attempted poisonings and the fatality, and calling on people to come together. And then she's going to suggest that if Russia changed course, then Russia can be brought back in from the cold, as it were. Worth pointing out, of course, that no-deal Brexit would probably mean a big breach of Britain's own obligations under the rules-based order, but that's not part of the speech as far as I could see. And she also names some new ships that are going to be in London. It doesn't look like her main foreign policy speech of the year is going to be a big talker from the preview that I saw today, but maybe there's something in the full thing that's yet to come.
Leslie Vinjamuri, how do you view now Britain's place in the world? I mean, sorry, that's a massive question, but just the way things are at the moment and Theresa May's speech, how do you view it?
Well, I think it links very much up to our last conversation, which is that Britain's very much on the back foot. It's seen as being a nation, a country that's looking very much internally and inwards and not taking an active role on the international stage, and at a time where it's one of its most important foreign policy partners, arguably the partner that it's seen as most important for many decades, is no longer really by its side. That's the United States. And very difficult for Theresa May to know how to play that. When she speaks in her foreign policy speech about the rules-based order, it's clearly at some level also a nod to the fact that the president is not, in the eyes of many European leaders, in the eyes of many people, not upholding that rules-based order. But Theresa May really hasn't been the European leader that's stepping in to fill that void. It's been Macron. It's been at different points in time Merkel, although she's now very weak domestically. But I think Britain there isn't a very clear sense that Britain can lead at this point in time.
And you obviously were covering the midterm elections in the States. And John, you were there observing as part of an OSCE observer mission. Do you think now the Democrats, having made some gains in the lower house, but not so many gains in the Senate, can they mobilise now to do better when it comes to challenging Donald Trump himself in 2 years' time, Leslie?
Well, I mean, it is an interesting question. It's the question certainly that everybody in Europe would like to know, because they're trying to read whether America's new engagement style overseas is likely to last beyond the next 2 years. And it's not clear what these elections tell us. They certainly tell us that it's up for grabs. It wasn't, the Republicans didn't take both houses. That, as you said, the Democrats took the House of Representatives. There are a number of elections still in play, as we know. Voter recounts in Florida, probably in Georgia. But you can read the narrative that you want off of this election. One thing that's clear is that the candidates that the Democrats were really looking to as potential hopefuls for leading the party into 2020, none of them have been successful. Andrew Gillum, not successful. So Beto in Texas, who was seen as a great hope, did very, very well, but did not win.
So they'll have to scramble to find another great hope then.
Exactly.
They haven't got much time.
And I think the other thing to note is that midterm elections are not a strong predictor of what happens in general elections.
John, your view then of those American elections? The question now, I suppose, as well, is whether the Democrats feel emboldened. Might they start launching investigations into Donald Trump's tax affairs and his dealings with Russia?
Well, I'm sure they will try to do so, and obviously they're in a much stronger position now. They've got control of the House of Representatives. But at one point, there was speculation that if the Democrats gained control of both the Senate and the House of Representatives, then that might lead to the beginning of impeachment procedures. Now, I think that clearly can't happen since the Republicans have strengthened their hold on the Senate. So to that extent, Donald Trump is not going to face some of the problems he might have done. But on the other hand, he doesn't have a compliant Congress since he now has one part of Congress who are against him.
Leslie.
I mean, the other thing to note there is that a lot of the Democrats that were successful were the moderate Democrats, not the progressive Democrats. Nancy Pelosi, likely to be Speaker of the House, has made it clear that she doesn't intend to go down the track of impeachment. But there will undoubtedly be a lot of investigations on a number of different issues. The chairmanships of the committees will now be owned by the Democrats. So the politics will change. And Trump is likely to have taken, despite his remarks, which frame this as unsurprisingly as a victory, he will be seeing this as a very considerable loss, and it will put him in a very difficult position. And what will a president do when he's constrained at home? He will work the areas where he has a lot of latitude. That's foreign policy, immigration, and trade policy. So we should expect to see a lot more and perhaps much more assertive president when he's acting overseas.
Thank you. Now, we've all been marking the centenary of the day that the First World War ended with tributes to servicemen and women from across the world who gave their lives. No one was exempt from the slaughter. In Parliament, 22 MPs lost their lives on the battlefield, as did several peers. More than 260 MPs were in uniform. The war brought new faces into Parliament, among them women, recruited as staff and later elected as members for the first time. Our reporter John Beasley's been visiting the biggest of the parliamentary war memorials at the entrance to Westminster Hall and speaking to some of those involved in chronicling how MPs, peers and ministers dealt with the conflict a century ago.
I'm Dr Catherine Ricks from the History of Parliament Trust.
And I'm Gordon Marsden, MP for Blackpool South and the Chair of the History for Parliament Trust.
We're looking at the Recording Angel, which is the parliamentary war memorial to the people who died in the First World War. So it includes members of the House of Lords, members of the House of Commons, officers and staff of the House, and also the sons of members of Parliament who died during the war.
And we have lists of names on recesses in the wall, as you say, with this large angelic figure right in the centre.
Yes, so we've got 8 panels there were 145 names, and now there are 146 names. The name that's been added is Lieutenant Gerald Arbuthnot, who was MP for Burnley from January to December 1910, and his name was previously missing from the memorial. I suspect record keeping at that point, in the confusion of the aftermath of war, just wasn't what it was today.
It's interesting, of course, that it's not just the members of the House of Commons killed, it's the sons of the members, quite a lot of significant leading politicians. And I see, for instance, Raymond Asquith, Prime Minister
son
today.
of H.H. Asquith, the Prime Minister.
Absolutely, son of that. And so this sense of loss, whether it was, an ordinary squaddy like my great-uncle who was killed at the age of 19, the first day of the Battle of the Somme, or whether it was the son of the Prime Minister, did begin throughout the war to produce this sense of intense comradeship across the classes.
If we look down the list of MPs who were killed, one of those names is Valentine Fleming, and he was the father of Ian Fleming, the creator of James Bond, and he was MP for South Oxfordshire from January 1910, and he was killed on the 20th of May 1917 by a German bombardment. And his obituary in the Times, interestingly, was written by Winston Churchill, and a framed copy of that obituary was apparently one of the prized possessions of Ian Fleming. He was only 8 when his father died. Churchill paid tribute to him, said the loss to the regiment is indescribable. He was absolutely our best officer, utterly fearless, full of resource and perfectly magnificent with his men. And I think that's a theme that comes through, actually, just reading about the MPs who died, the connection between their men. There's lots of tributes to them being very good with their men, and obviously, the fact that they've been killed, they're the ones going over the top, really leading from the front, not taking a cushy staff job behind the lines.
All the They put me in the army and they handed me a pack. They took away my nice new clothes and dolled me up in cack. They marched me 20 miles a day to fit me for the war.
There's certainly evidence that MPs came back in uniform on leave and they spoke in debate, and obviously they could give a very personal account of what the situation was like in the trenches. Also, MPs' letters weren't subject to censorship, so there's the names of the Cawley brothers, Harold and Oswald Cawley, who are both MPs and both killed in action, and they wrote back and told their father about the conditions that they'd suffered and what they thought about the senior officers and the problems that had been involved.
264 MPs in uniform, Gordon. That means that the chamber must have been depleted at quite a lot of the time during the First World War. Did it matter very much? I mean, how much power did the Commons have at the time?
Well, of course, the government, as the war progressed, took further and further powers to themselves, some of which were agreed in secret session, the famous Defence of the Realm Act, which started off relatively narrow and then became bigger and bigger. But I think that there was quite a lot of influence on the government. I think there was also quite a lot of tension between the generals about some of these MPs coming back and giving their view of things. And what we know about the way in which Lloyd George, after he became Prime Minister, I think probably Lloyd George, for his own purposes from time to time, quite valued these odd bits and pieces of things that came out in the chamber because it enabled him to put pressure on some of the generals who perhaps didn't think were quite doing what they should be doing.
Those few secret sittings aside, we do have, thanks to Hansard, the usual detailed written record of what went on in the Commons chamber throughout the Great War. Not so meetings of the Cabinet. Minutes were never taken at the time, so no record exists. At least, no official record.
Asquith, of course, found time to write, I think on some occasions, 2 or 3 letters to his mistress, where he quite happily talked about some of the things that he really shouldn't be talking about in a personal letter.
And he was doing this in cabinet meetings?
We're told so. We're told so.
A century on from those letters, reconciliation has become an important theme for commemorations of the Armistice. 10 days ago, at a special concert in Westminster Hall, the Parliamentary Choir and their opposite numbers from the German Bundestag Choir performed together. It was the third time in 4 years that the two groups had sung with one another.
We've become good friends. I mean, it was like embracing friends that you haven't seen for a while. And we know each of the choirs knows the character of the other choir. And I thought it was fascinating that the very first rehearsal we had, the two choirs just blended together beautifully.
The Conservative MP, Carolyn Spellman, who sings in the alto section.
It is a tremendous feeling to sing together. Something corporate happens when you sing with other human beings. No doubt that's what the soldiers felt when they started singing in their respective trenches and began to realise that they shared some of the music together. When we actually stand in this hall and sing together, it binds us together respectfully in remembering all the lives lost in these great wars.
As well as remembering those who gave their lives, Carolyn Spellman is mindful that the Great War had a profound effect on Parliament as an institution.
Yes, it really changed Parliament, and I speak as a female parliamentarian. Women got the vote after 1918, and during the First World War, women were drawn into roles that men previously had only occupied.
Historian Dr. Catherine Ricks agrees.
Mary Takanyagi from the Parliamentary Archives has done some fantastic research on the women staff who were employed, but started off as girl porters taking messages around the Commons. So women were becoming a more regular presence in the Commons as staff and in Parliament as staff before, of course, they had the vote and before they were admitted as MPs in 1918.
Keep the home fires burning.
But some things remain the same. The Palace of Westminster itself, despite all the recently erected scaffolding, remains substantially unchanged. And Labour MP Gordon Marsden, who chairs the History of Parliament Trust, says that MPs who've worn the Queen's uniform are still making their mark.
There was controversy then. There's controversy now. We now have, of course, a number of MPs on both sides of the House who have seen service in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and of course previous generations. Ben Wallace, for example, the Security Minister who saw service in Northern Ireland. So the military element in Parliament has not gone away, and in fact it's arguable, particularly because of the intensive service in Iraq and Afghanistan, that people are more forceful, more clued up, and more wanting to ask the big questions of was it worth it, because we do have those military presences as members of Parliament here today.
Inside out, till the boys come home.
That's the celebrated tenor John McCormack with Keep the Home Fires Burning, ending that report from John Beasley. And Sam Coates, you've been looking at tomorrow morning's front pages and websites, and of course Armistice celebrations, commemorations all over them.
The big choice for newspaper editors today was how much to do on the Armistice. The Times, pages 1 through 16, the nation salutes the fallen as its front page. The Daily Mail, never forget. The Daily Mirror, for your tomorrow, they gave their today. The Daily Express, in silent prayer with a picture of the Queen. Other papers take other editorial decisions, and inevitably Brexit is on most of the rest of the papers. The Daily Telegraph. For £1.80 tomorrow morning, you will discover that Boris Johnson opposes Theresa May's Brexit deal. He says that Theresa May is on the verge of almost total surrender, and people need to savour the full horror of this capitulation.
Capitulation, John, do you agree that it's a capitulation? And do you think it's time now for that leadership challenge to Theresa May?
Well, I think what matters is what comes out of the negotiation. If the negotiation produces a deal of the kind that is being discussed, which I don't think can get through Parliament, the Prime Minister has sort of tied her colours so firmly to this deal. If the deal doesn't get through, it is very difficult to see how she can continue.
She's got to go.
But part of our
She'd
problem...
have to go.
Well, I think if the deal was voted down by Parliament, it's almost impossible to see how she could continue.
And what about leadership challenge now? Do you think there's one like?
We're so close. And part of the difficulty is that under our new system, it takes quite a long time. And we have a clock ticking away. And it's already running out of time. But I think, as I say, the important thing will be the fate of this deal, either through the Cabinet or through Parliament.
So, John, are you seriously saying that if there was suddenly no Brexit plan, the first instinct of the Conservatives would be to oust the Prime Minister? We'd have no Brexit plan and no Prime Minister?
Well, I think if the Prime Minister's Brexit plan doesn't get through Parliament, I think it's quite difficult to see how the Prime Minister could continue, because she has staked her credibility. It's very hard for her to turn around and say, OK, well, my plan's been torn up by Parliament, I'll go away and think of another one.
But if you have a Prime Minister in office but not in power because Parliament is telling her to do something else, the only constitutional answer is to have a general election.
No, I don't think that is so at all. I think if there were to have the deal voted down, and if we could then go for the kind of deal which I and many others have been arguing for a long time, that is still possible to obtain. But it's becoming increasingly hard, given the amount of time available.
It gives chaos a different meaning altogether, really, doesn't it? But Sam, just continue, because I interrupted you.
The Financial Times contains on its front page very much the analysis that I gave you earlier. 48 Hours also, some pessimism out of Brussels sources for the FT, some more pressure from Eurosceptics, and also this thing that the Times wrote about last week, which is that Brussels is arguing that they need additional promises from Britain on things like environmental safeguards and other what are technically called level playing field initiatives in order to get the deal done. I suspect many Tories will find that quite painful. Independent May shelves crunch Brexit talks with Cabinet. That is a reference to the fact that tomorrow, Monday, there isn't going to be a special Cabinet deal. There might be a Cabinet on Tuesday that discusses Brexit. There might not. We hold our breath.
And November summit doesn't look likely. There is a summit possibly.
We don't know yet. We'll know by Wednesday. That's why there's this 48-hour feeling, and that we want to get to the position where there's either negotiations concluded and we can get on with ratification in all the different ways that it happens, or if it doesn't happen by about Wednesday, then yes, we're into December summit territory and the crunch rates being pushed back to the other side of Christmas.
Yes or no from Annalise and John? A deal by the end of this week in looking like it's likely, yes or no?
Well, it's not looking likely, not at the moment.
Annalise?
I have no idea. I only wish that it was a different group of people in charge of these negotiations, frankly. I think we'd be in a very different situation.
All right. Well, look, that is all we've got time for this evening. Thanks to my guests, Sam Coates, Annalise Dodds, John Whittingdale and Leslie Vinjamuri. And to make sure you don't miss the next episode of the Westminster Hour, please do subscribe to this podcast on BBC Sounds.